Before we begin the official proceedings tonight, how about an acknowledgement of country? That's the way, obviously, progressives traditionally kick things off in Australia, right? But here's a question for you. What do progressives do when they're not in Australia? Well, have a look at this. Energy Minister Chris Bowen in Dubai on a fool's errand to convince a bunch of sheikhs to phase out fossil fuel had this to say, opening his speech to the climate summit yesterday. Chris Bowen, who, let's remember, was in a desert sheikhdom, not Alice Springs, kicked off his speech to the climate summit thusly.
Friends, I begin with an acknowledgement that at the heart of action on climate change must be profound respect for those who've cared for our respective lands for millennia, the indigenous people across the world. I reaffirm our government's commitment to the inclusion of First Nations people in our climate change response and clean energy future, recognising that respect for indigenous knowledge, cultures and traditional practices is critical.
Well, I guess they didn't have a referendum in Dubai, but there is so much to unpack here. Among other things, if Bowen is talking about indigenous people across the world, well, ultimately, logically, isn't he talking about all people eventually? And really, does this give the right to, say, Anglo-Saxon Britons to weigh in on Australia's energy policy? It's all so incredibly virtuous and confusing and, dare I say, cringe. And speaking of cringe, can we also have a little word about Ed Husic and the freedom of speech? Now, as you probably know, there has been an awful lot of pro-Palestinian protest activity these days, coming mostly, exclusively almost, from the left, since Hamas's brutal terrorist massacres in Israel 2 months ago. One such protest involved players at the Sydney Theatre Company donning keffiyehs at an encore to show their solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Oddly, no one put on a kippah to show their sympathy with the 1,200 Israelis murdered by Hamas, but what are you going to do? The predictable debate about politics and art and free speech played out, and the fact that some people had an issue with the actor's performance and used their own free speech to say so raised the ire of Ed Husic. He's the Albanese government's industry minister, remember, and a Muslim who represents the Western Sydney seat of Greenway. And he thinks that people worrying that some of these Palestinian protests are going too far now smacks of a new McCarthyism. Yeah, that's right. Here's the minister on ABC Radio earlier today.
We had journalists, sign up to a letter that said we need to make sure that the way that we're reporting the conflict is accurate, and they've been taken off writing stories in relation to the conflict by their editorial boards. Doctors who joined in a petition that in particular focused on the humanitarian impact in Gaza, I've got reports now, are being professionally investigated for their participation in that. If people express a view and have the decency to show heart in relation to what's happening in Gaza and calling out the need to recognise humanity, are then effectively professionally blacklisted, I don't think that's right.
Well, there's a few things to say about this. First of all, even though many of his claims were overcooked and hysterical, the broad thesis of Joe McCarthy was not incorrect. America and America's institutions were subject to a program of communist infiltration directed by Moscow after World War II. But secondly, that letter some activist journalists signed, well, it's straight out of the lefty playbook, calling for a false context in their reporting that ignores the repeated attacks on Israel by its Arab neighbors and throwing around words like genocide and apartheid about Israel without noting, for example, the Hamas Charter, which is an explicitly genocidal document. But let me also say this. Ed Husic and others on the left should be real careful when they talk about free speech. Look, if you're a believer in free speech, as I am, or say you are, it is incumbent on you to make sure your words have been consistent on this subject. For example, in 2019, In the wake of the Christchurch massacre, Husic wrote that, quote, words like bullets do injure, unquote. Well, okay, but then where do we draw the line? That doesn't sound very free speechy to me. Look, this is truly a tricky one for a lot of people. I get this, particularly on the left, though the right has its own blind spots too. The great danger in these debates, though, is that laws to protect people from hate speech or incitement can sometimes be used as a cudgel by one side or another to shut their opponents up. And here I'm thinking of the case of Israel Folau. Back in 2019, the deeply religious, deeply Christian Folau posted an anti-gay marriage meme on his own private Instagram page. He didn't go and wave a no gay marriage banner after a rugby match, but he was still sacked and it was very controversial. And the case became a cause célèbre for the left, which back then thought that firing someone for making a political stance their bosses or audience disagreed with was cause for firing. Ultimately, Folau settled a wrongful dismissal case with Rugby Australia, but the Wallabies have never been the same since. And many of those who are today supporting the STC actors and actresses who don keffiyehs would have been the same people who back in 2019 called for Israel Folau to be sacked.